Now, the qualitative method most of you will be using will probably be the individual interview, where you get a group of people, each of you find a person or two to interview as it relates to your project. These are one-to-one interactions, and what you're trying to do is get the individual's experiences, have them talk about the topic you're interested in their own words and in their perspectives on that topic. It's useful the interviews are very useful when you're covering topics that may be too personal to discuss in a group setting. Remember, in a focus group, you're with a number of people and you're talking about something, but sometimes people may be reluctant to participate in a group environment if the topic is particularly personal. It's also appropriate to use interviews when you want to know what an individual thinks as opposed to what a group of individuals think. And that's why it's easier to identify what a particular person thinks and why he or she thinks that way than would be the case in a focus group. The disadvantage of an interview compared to a focus group is you don't get any chaining and brainstorming of ideas in which the participants contribute to one another's ideas in that group. So with an interview, you're just hearing what that one person has to say. Now, the book talks about different types of interviews, and we'll talk about two particular types here, even though you're only going to really focus on one type of interview. So by far the most common certainly the one you will use, and by far the most common that qualitative researchers use, is a semi-structured interview. These interviews are the ones that you're familiar with. They have a format. There's a kind of a general open-ended question that starts off, and then depending on how the person is answering that question, you follow up with some very specific probes or direct the person to address a particular issue in more detail and things like that. What you're trying to do there is to allow a person the opportunity to speak on a topic and the freedom to be able to talk about that in the way they want to. That then gives you some information that you can then follow up on and probe with regard to specific things that they may have said. And obviously to do that, you need to avoid close-ended questions which limit the range of responses. You want to focus more on what they have to say and then have them elaborate on specific points. Now, in ethnographic interviews, these are non-directive. Now, you won't be doing these for your research project, but some people do. This is where you start with a general question, but then you just kind of move into a conversation where both the interviewer and the participant are talking about things. They may get into a lot of storytelling and whatnot. You're kind of looking at the direction that it goes because you're interested in how this person elaborates on the topic that you've been talking about. Whereas with semi-structured, you really want specific bits of information regarding some of the things that they're talking about. You may have 3 or 4 questions that you would like for them to address and that you would like to follow up with more explanation or information as needed. Ethnographic interview, you're just kind of letting it go in the direction that it's going to go because that's the direction that the person you're talking to chose to do it that way, and through that you get to hear their experiences uninterrupted by you as it relates to that particular question. Now, when you do semi-structured interviews, you typically have one of 2 sequences that you can follow. One is the funnel structure, where we start with some very general questions, and then you start moving very specifically to more specific questions as it relates to what your research questions are. So for example, I might start out, if I was trying to if I was in a job interview or something like that, interviewing you. That's kind of like a semi-structured interview. I might start out by saying something like, so tell me about what it's like being an undergraduate at Texas A&M. And you would start talking about that. Then I might follow up with, okay, well, tell me a little bit about your favorite courses. So then you might then focus specifically on that. And then that could go on until I might ask, tell me about a particular assignment you did that was particularly fulfilling or that you enjoyed. And then you could tell me about that, and could then elaborate. So what about that assignment was so fulfilling? So that is a structure where you start general and you move to the more specific. The inverted funnel is just the other way. The funnel structure is really probably the most common. The inverted funnel, though, you just start by being very specific, then moving up. So I might start out by saying, tell me about your favorite TV show, and you can tell me whatever that TV show is. And then I might say, in your opinion, what makes a television series entertaining enough to watch it regularly, then you might elaborate on that, since I've already asked you about your favorite show. And then I might follow up even more and say, what should television producers be thinking about these days as they start preparing for television content in the age of social media and Netflix, when fewer people are watching television shows. So that way I start from the very specific and then move up to the more general. The structure that people often use if you're going to use a series of questions, particularly if they're going to get into personal topics, is the sandwich structure. Now, when you do your research projects, understand that you probably won't be using this kind of structure. You'll probably just be using a topical structure that we'll talk about later in class. But the sandwich structure is particularly useful if you're trying to get information that could be potentially, personal or sensitive. And sometimes in semi-structured interviews, you need to get that. So you usually start with a light question. So I might say, my project was saying, I want to look at family conversation around dinner, and particularly about conflict in family conversation. I might start out light. So tell me about dinner time at your family. So that seems to be a pretty non-threatening, easy thing to talk about. Then I might follow up with a more in-depth probe. So how do your parents behave during dinner? How do they talk to people and to one another during dinner time? Then I might get to the particular sensitive questions that I might be interested in. Do conflicts arise at dinner? And you mention yes, and I say, well, elaborate on some of those. Then I might get into even more specific information by saying, describe a recent conflict that came up. So you see, this is the material I'm really interested in, is to get details on family conflicts that happen at the dinner table. Then I might move back out before we conclude the interview back to a lighter question, one that might be easier or more optimistic for the person to answer, and that might be, describe the perfect dinner time conversation you could have with your family. So when you do an interview, there are several key issues to monitor. One of those is you've got to allow sufficient time because it's going to the interviews do take time. When you do your interviews, again, depending on what topic you're choosing, I think it's reasonable to think that you're going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes with the person you're interviewing. Now, real semi-structured interviews where you're really doing it for research purposes, they can go on for 30 minutes or an hour and a half. So you need to determine how much time there is that you have to do the interview and select questions and think about potential probes appropriate for that amount of time. You monitor times. You certainly want to cover all the issues you want to cover in the interviews you have with people. And again, like focus groups, ideally you audio record the interaction. But again, for this project, you could just be taking notes, and that will be sufficient. Now, as an interviewer, focus on facilitation, not participation. So you want to hear what they have to say. This isn't about you talking about what you believe and know. You're trying to get them to talk about the things that you're interested in hearing what they have to say. Right? So with a focus group, what you're trying to do is monitor facilitate the interaction and to make sure there's some balance in the interaction. In this particular case, what you're trying to do is facilitate the individual's participation to talk and be disclosive about things that you're interested in. Now, the key disadvantage in an interview is collecting data can be very time consuming. So in a focus group, we could probably spend an hour with a focus group, 30 minutes or an hour with a focus group. Let's say 30 minutes for the sake of this example. We may have gotten the views of 6 or 7 people. On the other hand, if we were to allow 30 minutes of time for an interview, we may have only gotten 2 interviews in that period of time, whereas with the focus group, we would have heard from, like, as I said, 6 or 7 people. So they can be time consuming, but you do get responses of individual participants.